Hello, everyone. My name's Andrew Pearson. These are some excerpts from an essay I wrote for my thesis titled On Overcoming Scarcity. The essay itself is one of three which I wrote this semester on why I joined the Catholic Church and my hopes for my future in it. Anyway, this is the essay. I think my love of the used, which I don't think reaches the level of hoarding or stinginess, may be congenital. My maternal grandfather, whom my parents always acknowledged was a very unique man, grew up during the Great Depression, and my mom says he nearly filled his office as an adult with books, documents, and trinkets. Some of these were really interesting, like the genealogies of the European royal families, which he drew by hand, or a katana that his Japanese friend gave him during his army service in the US occupation. But a lot more were useless. My mother also saves things compulsively, whether she learned to or had the instinct for it, and so do I. Where it came from is mostly unimportant to me. This impulse to gather and save, to eat leftovers and live in the wake of production, has been crucial to my religious development, and I want to examine both its good and its bad results in me in this essay. Last March, I chose my patron saint, Catherine Drexel, without knowing much about her. I read on an internet index of saints that she was an heiress and a philanthropist who became a religious sister and emptied her trust fund building missions and schools for Black and Native Americans. I was already in the market for an obscure patron saint because I'd been told in confirmation classes that such a saint would have more prayer time to lavish upon her charges than a popular saint like Francis of Assisi or the Apostle John would. Besides this, I enjoy taking shelter in niches, making space in institutional spots where others haven't yet gone or aren't currently, nooks and crannies and the like, and confirmation, when I would be accepted into the church, would happen in less than a month at Easter. So I was under pressure to make a choice, any choice. I weighed St. Catherine with my other optional saints. I chose her and I put her name on my confirmation card and asked her to pray for the increase of my love of justice. Later that year, after joining the Catholic Church, I prepared to give a final speech in front of my public speaking class in praise of a person or a thing. I chose as the subject my patron saint. I thought she was a good example of the kind of Catholic who built up the racial and social justice causes that my classmates praise. Surveying some members of my class, I found that none of them knew who she was. I was disappointed, probably paradoxically, because I'd chosen her because of her low contemporary profile. But I was also glad to be able to give them new knowledge of her. The reader of this essay probably hadn't heard of her before now either, which is surprising since, according to her friend Bishop Spellman, during her lifetime she held probably the highest public profile of any woman in America. To bone up on the facts, I read Catherine Burton's biography, The Golden Door, The Life of St. Catherine Drexel. Catherine Drexel. At the time it was written, she wasn't yet canonized. But I was told once that you don't choose a patron saint. The saint is assigned to you by God from before all time, and you simply find out in the course of things who yours is. From the Golden Door and other online sources, I learned that my hastily selected patroness and I had much more in common than I first supposed. As a religious sister, Catherine Drexel poured money into her missions and schools and traveled cross country evaluating new sites for them. In her personal life, however, she was exceedingly thrifty. She would write pencils down to the erasers, walk around with broken shoelaces as long as they lasted, and write letters on the unused flip sides of other letters. She did, and other things were things like what I would do, and she rejoiced over each dollar saved from her personal expenses. In the words of Miss Burton. Her habits puzzled me when I first read The Golden Door, a charitable enterprise that handled millions of dollars. What was the point of pinching these pennies in her personal expenses? And I initially thought that maybe she shared my obsession with waste and use. I think now that I was mistaken. Most likely she was denying herself these little amenities as part of the Catholic practice of mortification, to bring her desires and her body under control and channel her energy more effectively towards prayer and charitable work. Where I use and gather out of a worldly obsession with waste, she did so to improve her love of God and her fight against American oppression. There's a lesson for me in this. To gather is not good unless it's really dedicated to higher purposes. That I'll discuss later in this essay. Like me, St. Catherine was a somewhat worldly child with a, quote, inordinate delight in pretty things, end quote, though she never slipped into atheism like I did. We were, however, brought to our senses by similar experiences of the futility of the world. She wrote a letter to her bishop and spiritual director in which she said that, quote, my heart is very sorrowful, because like the little girl who wept when she found that her doll was stuffed with sawdust and her drum was hollow, I too have made a horrifying discovery, and my discovery, like hers, is true. I ripped open both the doll and the drum, and the fact lies plainly and in all its glaring reality before me. All, 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 there is no exception, is passing away and will pass away. End quote. Our corresponding experiences retaught me a lesson I ought to have learned early on in my Christian life. If all things pass away, so does collecting and hoarding things for its own sake and all the profit of it. To save things does not build up treasure in heaven by itself. Still, I didn't learn or practice this knowledge for a long time. Little tears spring to my eyes even as I reread this passage, not for sorrow at the truth of it, but for the comradeship we have in this respect. St. Catherine and I both had to reckon with the fact that creation isn't self-sufficient, that some logic greater than that of the world is needed to make life worth living. This realization was for both of us the beginning of a new Catholic way of life. I feed off leftovers because I hate to countenance waste, but in doing that I also sublimate the desire to be a net positive source of some quality that's hard to describe. I'll call it vitality to people around me, rather than a burden. To channel an energy or a way of life that would sustain me and other people. In the past, I didn't want to be a psychic taker because it seemed unsustainable and would subject me to danger when the people who sustained me went away. I wanted to find and associate myself with the source of life, and that was why I desired to be productive and to reduce my net consumption as much as possible. This desire has led me down some bad paths, like not telling others the truth about my inner state and not wanting to be a burden, but it also caused me to admire the Christians I knew who were sources of energy and help and justice. In my first essay on the time leading up to my initial decision to become a Catholic, I made much of my friend Benjamin Love. In any situation, it seems Benjamin's ready, if not always with exactly the right advice, then with what's better or necessary with the right advice. A good attitude and a willingness to listen. He smiles all the time, too. Over time, I came to think of him as the kind of man with the necessary energy to keep society going. Matthew Walther, the journalist, whom I mentioned in that same essay, also appealed to me at this point because his values were so unified that he could attack the problems he saw in the world, while seeming to have a coherent account of what could be or what was right about it. These men showed me that to be a Christian encompasses an ardent desire for the world's well-being, understanding the destinations of the things of the world, and turning to God for consolation and direction instead of to those things. It's one of my strongest bonds to St. Catherine Drexel as well, the desire to be of service and to be vital. That was the ethos I admired in all of these, in the beginning of my Christian aspirations. It was following the logic of the world to its end, which finally drove me out of my scarcity obsession, contemplating death and the end of civilization. When the hold of materialist rationalism would be broken, there would be no use for all the spare rubber bands I'd collected, which finally freed me from the scarcity mindset. Of course, because I built my previous self around accumulation and worldly pursuits and things that perish. The contemplation of death also plunged me into a terrible depression for the next 4 months. But even that kind of suffering fits into a Christian theodicy. Blessed Fulton Sheen, a bishop who preached to Americans on TV during the Cold War, said that the only way the good Lord can get into some hearts is by breaking them. And Alistair McIntyre teaches also that, quote, courage and gracefulness of spirit can be hard-won responses to afflictions, end quote. Unlike my worldly self, which feared brokenness and sorrow, a Christian becomes more like his God when he dares to take them on, or even to reach out with tenderness to those who suffer from them. The Christian life requires its practitioners to balance the scales of their lives with the invisible weight of the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, and to venture apparent extremes that are only possible when weighted in the other direction by those virtues. The temptation of self-sufficiency is a misdirected Pelagian attempt at this balance, replacing the theological virtues with their own natural abilities. But even after I realized my incapacity to sacrifice on my own, some kind of sacrifice must still be made. Scarcity and fasting have their place in the equation, even if it isn't at the top. Consider St. Catherine. Many rich people with no consideration at all for the Lord have given a lot more than her $20 million to charity, though few exhausted their personal resources like she did. Her ministries of schools and missions renders tangible benefits all through society. Quote, in nearly every pueblo and reservation, one bishop said in 1941, we find Indians young and old who have benefited by the training they received at St. Catherine's schools, end quote. And even though the original students are now dead or extremely old, we still live among their great-grandchildren who benefited from the development and attention their ancestors received. It makes sense without admitting supernatural causes in a natural way, though it is very difficult to give like she did. What really baffles the worldly mind was how St. Catherine lived. Why give up shoelaces and clean paper and pencils and meals? Why give up marriage? Her last years challenged the world the most. Incapacitated by a heart attack at 76, she prayed in an upper bedroom of a religious order's house each day for 19 years. What did she do with all that time? Whom did she help? Asked bleeding hearts. She wrote nothing like St. Augustine's Confessions or St. Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle, which have profited millions of readers over hundreds of years. Yet it was during this time, after 44 years of making structural improvements to American society, when Mother Mary Catherine most became St. Catherine Drexel. In sickness, she was, quote, inactive, wasted, as short-sighted people say, end quote. As Mother Genevieve Galois writes in The Life of Little St. Placid, quote, but she felt welling up inside her the revelation of a new life. Freed of health, human activity, the natural joy of living, she clings purely and simply to the divine action, end quote. In her time outside the convent, St. Catherine used the logic of efficient capital allocation as an instrument to improve her love of God and to do right by other human beings. It was her 19 years in prayer and weakness that rejected that logic. When she leaned onto her hardships, depended entirely on her sisters for her needs, and produced nothing but prayers. MacIntyre wrote that the severely disabled, like St. Catherine, aren't passive objects of benevolence, but, quote, they give us the possibility of learning something essential, end quote. The hard-won glory of human love, the kind which only brokenness and dependence and sharing amid scarcity can bring out. And to cultivate an anti-scarce society, we should practice, quote, spending the moments extravagantly, end quote, as Patrick Madden says, on the needy, on the dependent, on our families and friends, and on God. Capital and its materials logic need not be conquered in, quote, an as yet unrealizable future, end quote, as MacIntyre says of communist projections to the future. Instead, they can be resisted with every uncalculated act of kindness and love.